The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Velthorn's main square, as Queen Morgana adjusted her black silk gloves, her pale eyes surveying the gathered crowd with cold satisfaction. The wooden platform stood ready, its posts blackened from previous executions, while the iron brazier glowed red-hot with burning coals and branding irons. "Bring forth the traitor," she commanded, her voice carrying across the silent square. Sir Aldrich of Ravenspire walked with his head held high, despite the chains binding his wrists. His dark hair fell across his scarred face, evidence of countless battles fought in service to the crown. The crowd murmured. Many remembered how he had saved the kingdom from northern raiders just 2 years prior. But Queen Morgana's paranoia had grown like a cancer, and Lord Cassius's whispered accusations of treachery had found fertile ground in her suspicious mind. "You stand accused of conspiring against the crown," Morgana announced, though her voice lacked conviction. "The penalty is death by fire." Aldrich's gray eyes met hers steadily. "I have served you faithfully for 10 years, Your Majesty. If loyalty is now treason, then your kingdom is already lost." The Queen's jaw tightened. She gestured to the guards, who began securing him to the stake. As kindling was piled around his feet, Aldrich closed his eyes and thought of the letter that had been planted in his chambers, the one that sealed his fate. Lord Cassius wanted his position, his lands, his influence. This was merely the price of ambition in Morgana's court. "And now," the Queen continued, turning to watch as a second prisoner was dragged forward, "the witch who dares to defy nature itself." Mira stumbled as the guards released her, her auburn hair tangled and her simple healer's dress torn. Her green eyes blazed with defiance despite the fear coursing through her veins. She had saved Lord Cassius's own son from fever just months ago, yet here she stood condemned because too many people had begun to whisper that her healing touch was supernatural. "You practice dark arts," Morgana declared, though she knew it was a lie. Mira's only crime was being too skilled, too successful, too beloved by the common people. "You will be branded and left in the wilderness to die as heaven wills it." "I heal people," Mira said quietly, her voice barely carrying over the crowd's nervous shuffling. "Is that truly evil in your eyes?" The Queen's response was to nod toward the executioner, who lifted a glowing brand shaped like a twisted serpent, the mark of the witch. As the flames began to lick at the kindling around Aldrich's feet, he opened his eyes one last time. Through the smoke, he saw Mira's face contorting in agony as the brand seared into her shoulder. Their eyes met across the square, two innocent souls sharing a moment of understanding in their final breaths. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The wind shifted suddenly, blowing the flames away from Aldrich's body just as an old sewer grate gave way beneath the branding platform. Mira fell through into the tunnels below, the chaos allowing her to slip her loosened bonds. Above ground, the crowd's attention remained fixed on the knight who seemed to burn yet somehow still breathed. Aldrich felt the flames char his clothes and sear his skin, but his years of battle had taught him to endure pain. As thick smoke clouded the square, he worked frantically at the ropes binding him to the stake. The crowd assumed his movements were death throes. In the confusion, both prisoners vanished. Hours later, as servants cleared the square, Queen Morgana stood at her chamber window, staring down at the empty platform. Lord Cassius entered behind her, his satisfaction evident. "It is done, Your Majesty. The kingdom is safer without them." But Morgana felt no relief. Something in those final moments had unsettled her, the way they had looked at each other, as if sharing a secret. She shook her head, dismissing the thought. "Yes," she murmured, "they are dead. They can no longer threaten us." If only she knew how wrong she was. In the depths of the castle's forgotten passages, two souls thought dead were beginning a journey that would change everything. The abandoned passages beneath Velthorn Castle had not seen human footsteps in decades. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light that filtered through ancient ventilation grates as Aldrich dragged himself deeper into the maze of forgotten corridors. His body screamed with every movement. The flames had left angry red welts across his chest and arms, his clothes hung in charred tatters, and breathing felt like swallowing glass. He collapsed against a stone wall, his vision blurring from pain and exhaustion. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had survived the Queen's execution only to die slowly in the bowels of her own castle. As consciousness began to slip away, he heard the soft echo of footsteps approaching through the darkness. Mira emerged from the shadows like a ghost, her healer's instincts immediately assessing his injuries. The brand on her shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, but her concern for the dying knight overrode her own pain. She had been wandering these tunnels for hours, following the sound of his labored breathing. "You're badly burned," she whispered, kneeling beside him. Her fingers hovered over his wounds, not quite daring to touch. "I can help you, but you need to trust me." Aldrich's gray eyes focused on her face with effort. "The witch," he rasped, then managed a bitter smile. "I suppose we're both ghosts now." "Not ghosts," she corrected, already tearing strips from her underdress to fashion bandages. "Survivors." Over the following days, they created a makeshift sanctuary in a forgotten storage chamber. Mira used her knowledge of herbs to treat their wounds with supplies she gathered during careful raids on the castle's gardens and kitchens. She brewed healing teas from stolen mint and chamomile, applied honey to Aldrich's burns, and somehow procured clean cloth for proper bandages. Aldrich, despite his injuries, proved resourceful in other ways. His knowledge of the castle's layout helped them navigate safely, and his military training enabled him to scout guard patterns and safe passages. He fashioned crude weapons from discarded metal and created early warning systems using pebbles and string. "How did you know about these passages?" Mira asked one evening as she changed his bandages by candlelight. Her touch was gentle but professional, though she couldn't ignore how his muscles tensed beneath her fingers. "My father served the old king," Aldrich replied, watching her work. "He used to tell me stories about the secret ways built for times of siege. I never thought I'd need them to hide from my own queen." Their conversations during those long, dark days revealed depths neither had expected. Mira spoke of her childhood, learning healing arts from her grandmother, of the villagers who trusted her with their lives, of the simple joy she found in easing suffering. Aldrich shared memories of battles fought with honor, of men he'd saved and lost, of his growing disillusionment with Morgana's increasingly erratic rule. As his burns began to heal under her care, something else began to grow between them. It started innocently, her hand lingering on his forehead while checking for fever, his fingers brushing hers when he helped her tend the tiny herb garden she'd started in their hidden chamber. But confined together in the intimate darkness, sharing whispered conversations and desperate hopes, the space between them seemed to shrink each day. The turning point came during his second week of recovery. Mira had been applying a new salve to the worst of his burns when Aldrich suddenly caught her wrist, his eyes intense in the flickering candlelight. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly. "You could have escaped the city by now. Why risk your life for someone you barely know?" She looked down at their joined hands, her pulse quickening. "Because leaving you to die would make me the monster they claimed I was. And if I were truly the traitor they named me, are you?" she challenged, meeting his gaze. Instead of answering with words, he drew her closer until their faces were inches apart. The kiss that followed was soft at first, tentative, born of shared loneliness and the desperate need for human connection. But as she melted against him, it deepened into something hungry and profound. When they broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Mira traced the line of his jaw with trembling fingers. "We're supposed to be dead," she whispered. "Then let the dead comfort each other," he replied, pulling her down beside him on their makeshift bed. That night, they found solace in each other's arms, their touches gentle around healing wounds, their whispered endearments a balm against the cruelty they had endured. In the darkness of their hidden world, they discovered that love could bloom even in the deepest shadows. But as dawn approached and reality crept back in, they knew their sanctuary couldn't last forever. They were survivors, not ghosts, and survivors eventually had to face the world above. "What happens now?" Mira asked, her head resting on Aldrich's chest as she listened to his steady heartbeat. "Now," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination, We become something the Queen never expected, enemies who know all her secrets hidden in plain sight. The game was about to begin. 3 months had passed since their supposed deaths, and the castle above had settled into its familiar rhythms of paranoia and whispered conversations. Queen Morgana's nightmares had grown worse, dreams of burning men who wouldn't die and branded, women who laughed in the flames. But Lord Cassius assured her these were merely guilt-born phantoms, nothing more. If only they knew that the phantoms were very much alive. Aldrich emerged from the servants' entrance before dawn, his appearance so altered that his own men wouldn't recognize him. The burns had healed into a network of twisted scars that ran from his left temple down to his collarbone, giving his face a haunting, otherworldly quality. He had shaved his head and grown a beard to further disguise his features. Most importantly, he had learned to move differently, hunched slightly, favoring his left leg, adopting the careful gait of a man broken by life. Marcus the Mute, the stable master, had called him when he'd applied for work 2 weeks prior. The story was simple. A former soldier traumatized by war, his voice destroyed by inhaling flames during a siege. His scarred hands still held skill, with horses, and the castle always needed men willing to work for little pay and fewer questions. Mira's transformation had been even more dramatic. She had dyed her distinctive auburn hair a common brown using walnut hulls and soot, and she'd learned to powder her face to appear more ordinary. The brand on her shoulder remained hidden beneath carefully arranged clothing. She moved through the kitchens as Elena, a quiet girl from a distant village whose family had died of plague, leaving her with nothing but a willingness to work hard. Their reunion each night in the hidden passages had become the anchor of their existence. By day, they played their roles perfectly, the broken stable hand and the grief-stricken kitchen maid. But in the darkness below, they were themselves again. Lovers, conspirators, and survivors planning their careful ascent back to relevance. The Queen grows more suspicious each day, Mira reported as she tended a small fire in their chamber. The cook says she's had 3 food tasters replaced this month alone. She trusts no one. Aldrich nodded grimly as he cleaned his hands after a day in the stables. Lord Cassius has been recruiting new guards, men with no loyalty to the old ways. But they're sloppy, undisciplined. They talk too freely around the horses. He moved behind her, his scarred hands settling on her shoulders as she stirred their simple supper. Even after months together, her presence still amazed him. This brave woman who had chosen to stay and fight rather than flee to safety. "What did you learn today?" she asked, leaning back against his chest. "The Queen has been corresponding with someone beyond our borders. Cassius mentioned sealed letters that arrive with the northern traders." His lips brushed her hair as he spoke. "And there's something else. She's been asking questions about the old passages. Someone told her there are ways to move through the castle unseen." Mira turned in his arms, concern flickering in her green eyes. "How much does she know?" "Not enough to find us yet, but too much for comfort." He cupped her face gently, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek. "We need to move faster." Their lips met in a kiss that tasted of urgency and unspoken fears. These stolen moments had become precious beyond measure, every touch a defiance of the fate that had tried to separate them forever. As the kiss deepened, Aldrich lifted her against him, carrying her to their simple bed of stolen blankets and borrowed pillows. Their lovemaking had evolved from desperate comfort to something deeper and more complex. Every caress was a promise, every whispered endearment a vow of survival. Mira's fingers traced the scars on his chest, marks of the fire that should have killed him, while he worshipped the brand on her shoulder with tender kisses, transforming the symbol of her persecution into something beautiful and sacred between them. "I love you," she breathed against his neck as he moved within her, their bodies finding the rhythm they had learned in shadows and secrecy. "And I love you," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. Whatever happens above, that truth remains. Later, as they lay entwined in the aftermath, they finalized their plans. It was time to move beyond mere survival. Time to reclaim their places in the world above, but on their own terms. The harvest festival is in 2 weeks, Mira said, tracing patterns on his chest. The queen will want entertainment, new faces among the servants. And Lord Cassius will want to impress her with his efficiency, Aldrich added. It's the perfect opportunity. They had learned patience in the darkness, but they had also learned cunning. The stable hand who never spoke would gradually prove his worth with horses and weapons. The kitchen maid with the sad eyes would catch attention with her grace and mysterious past. They would rise through the ranks not as the knight and healer who had been condemned, but as new players in the queen's deadly game. Are you ready to see her again? Mira asked quietly. To stand in the same room and pretend you're someone else? Aldrich's smile was sharp as a blade. I've been ready since the flames first touched my skin. She thinks she destroyed us, but we're about to show her what resurrection really looks like. The dead were about to walk among the living, and Queen Morgana would never see them coming. The harvest festival had transformed Valethorn Castle into a glittering spectacle of false prosperity. Banners hung from every tower, minstrels filled the halls with music, and the great hall blazed with the light of 1,000 candles. Queen. Morgana presided over it all like a spider at the center of her web, her black silk gown making her pale skin appear almost translucent in the flickering light. She had not been sleeping well. The nightmares continued, visions of accusatory eyes and whispered voices calling her name in the darkness. Lord Cassius had suggested the festival as a distraction, a way to remind the kingdom of their queen's power and beneficence. But even surrounded by revelry, Morgana felt watched. Your Majesty, a soft voice spoke beside her throne. Might I refill your wine? Morgana glanced up to see a young serving woman with modest brown hair and remarkable green eyes. There was something compelling about her, a quiet dignity that stood out among the usual cowering servants. You're new, the queen observed, studying the girl's face. What is your name? Elena, Your Majesty, Mira replied with a perfect curtsy. I've been working in the kitchen since my family's passing. Elena, Morgana repeated as if tasting the name. You speak well for a kitchen maid. My mother believed education was important even for common folk. Mira's eyes met the queen steadily, showing neither fear nor improper boldness. She said knowledge was the one thing that could never be taken from you. Something in the response intrigued Morgana. Perhaps it was the girl's composure, or the hint of loss that shadowed her words. Remain close this evening. I may have need of your services. As the feast continued, Morgana found herself watching Elena move through the hall. The girl served wine with practiced grace, her presence somehow soothing in a way the queen couldn't quite explain. When Elena leaned close to refill her goblet, Morgana caught the faint scent of lavender and something else, something that reminded her of simpler times. Meanwhile, at the far end of the hall, a new guard stood silent vigil by the doors. The man's scarred face might have been off-putting in daylight, but by candlelight the marks gave him a mysterious, almost dangerous appeal. Lord Cassius had recommended him. Marcus, the mute soldier who had proven surprisingly skilled with both sword and strategy, despite his humble position. Queen Morgana's gaze drifted to the silent guardian more than once throughout the evening. There was something about his stillness, the way he watched everything while appearing to see nothing. When their eyes met across the crowded hall, she felt an unexpected flutter of, what? Fear? Excitement? She couldn't quite name the sensation. As the night wore on, the queen dismissed most of her attendants, keeping only Elena nearby. The girl's quiet presence had become oddly comforting, and Morgana found herself speaking more freely than usual. Do you ever feel that the world conspires against you, Elena? She asked as the servant helped her remove her heavy ceremonial jewelry. I think the world is often unkind, Your Majesty, Mira replied carefully. But I've learned that what seems like conspiracy is usually just loneliness wearing different masks. The response surprised Morgana with its insight. You speak as one who has known loss. Haven't we all? Mira's fingers were gentle as she unclasped the queen's necklace. The question is whether we let loss make us smaller or use it to understand others' pain. For a moment, Morgana saw herself reflected in the girl's eyes, not as a queen, but as a woman who had loved and lost and learned to fear everyone around her. The vulnerability of the moment should have felt dangerous, but instead it felt liberating. 3 floors below, Aldrich waited in the shadows of their hidden chamber, his body tense with controlled rage. He had watched Mira throughout the evening, seen how naturally she had slipped into the role of confidant to the woman who had ordered their deaths. The plan was working perfectly, but that didn't make it easier to bear. When Mira finally descended to their sanctuary near midnight, she found him pacing like a caged wolf. "She suspects nothing," Mira said quietly, beginning to undress. "In fact, I think she's beginning to trust me." "And the guard position?" Aldrich asked, though his eyes were fixed on the graceful curve of her spine as she removed her servant's dress. "Cassius recommended you for the Queen's personal detail. You'll begin tomorrow." She turned to face him, wearing only her chemise, and saw the storm brewing in his gray eyes. "What is it?" Instead of answering, he crossed the space between them, in 2 quick strides, his hands framing her face as he kissed her with desperate intensity. The kiss tasted of jealousy and possession, of a love so fierce it bordered on madness. "Watching you serve her," he breathed against her lips, "pretending to care for the woman who wanted us burned and branded." "It's just a role," she whispered, her hands already working at the laces of his shirt. "None of it is real." "This is real," he said fiercely, lifting her onto their small table, his hand skimming up her thighs. "This is the only truth in this place of lies." Their coupling that night was urgent and almost savage, as if they were trying to burn away the memory of her gentle service to their enemy. Mira's back arched as he took her there against the rough wood, her nails digging into his scarred shoulders as he moved within her with desperate intensity. "Say my name," he demanded, his voice rough with need and something darker. "Aldrich," she gasped, her legs wrapping around his waist to draw him deeper. "My love, my heart, my—" The words dissolved into wordless cries as they found their release together, clinging to each other like survivors of a shipwreck. Later, as they lay entwined on their makeshift bed, Mira traced the newest tension lines around his eyes. "She's just a lonely woman who's forgotten how to trust," she said softly. "Her paranoia has isolated her from everyone who might genuinely care for her welfare." "Good," Aldrich replied coldly. "Isolation will make our task easier." But even as he spoke, he wondered if Mira's natural compassion might prove to be their greatest weakness or their ultimate strength. The game they were playing had stakes higher than revenge. They were gambling with their very souls. Above them, Queen Morgana lay sleepless in her royal chambers, thinking of green eyes and gentle hands of a mute guard whose silence somehow spoke volumes. She was beginning to feel less alone than she had in months, and the feeling both comforted and terrified her. If only she knew that her new confidants had once screamed her name as flames and brands sought to destroy them. If only she knew that the dead had learned to love as fiercely as they had learned to hate. The final act was about to begin. The winter solstice brought with it a bitter cold that seemed to seep into the very stones of Valethorn Castle. Queen Morgana had grown increasingly dependent on Elena's calming presence and Marcus's silent protection over the past months. The nightmares had lessened, replaced by something that felt almost like contentment, a dangerous emotion for a ruler who had survived by trusting no one. It was Lord Cassius who finally overplayed his hand. "Your Majesty," he said, entering her private chambers where Elena was arranging fresh flowers and Marcus stood guard by the window. "I bring troubling news about your new favorites." Morgana looked up from the correspondence she had been reading, her pale eyes sharp with sudden attention. "What news?" Cassius cast meaningful glances at both Elena and Marcus. "Perhaps we should speak privately." "They stay," the Queen said firmly. "Elena and Marcus have proven their loyalty beyond question. Speak freely." The dismissal stung Cassius visibly, but he pressed on. "I've received information suggesting that your mute guard may not be as voiceless as he appears, and the kitchen maid. There are whispers that she practices the healing arts in secret. Elena's hand stilled on the flower arrangement while Marcus remained motionless by the window. But Morgana had learned to read the subtle signs of tension in both her companions over these past months. "What are you suggesting, Lord Cassius?" Her voice carried a warning edge. "I suggest they are not who they claim to be," he said boldly. "I suggest they may be the very enemies we thought destroyed months ago." The silence that followed was deafening. Morgana rose slowly from her chair, her gaze moving between Elena and Marcus. For the first time in months, she truly looked at them, not as the loyal servants they had appeared to be, but as the accused traitor and condemned witch who had faced her judgment in the town square. "Elena," she said quietly, "show me your shoulder." Mira met the Queen's eyes steadily. "Your Majesty, show me." With careful dignity, Mira set down the flowers and slowly unlaced the shoulder of her dress, revealing the twisted serpent brand that marked her as a condemned witch. The scar tissue had healed into a raised symbol that seemed to writhe in the firelight. Morgana's face went white, but she turned to Marcus with eerie calm. "And you, speak. I command it." Aldrich slowly turned from the window, and when he spoke, his voice was the same one that had declared his innocence in the town square months ago. "Hello, Morgana. You look well for someone who hasn't been sleeping." Lord Cassius drew his sword, but faster than thought, Marcus, Aldrich, had crossed the room and disarmed him. The blade clattered to the floor as Cassius found himself pressed against the wall, a scarred hand at his throat. "Sit down, Cassius," Aldrich said pleasantly. "We have so much to discuss." Queen Morgana sank back into her chair, her mind reeling. "You're supposed to be dead. I watched you burn. I watched her branded. You watched what you thought was justice," Mira said gently, approaching the Queen with the same careful grace she had shown for months. "But it was merely the beginning of our story." "You've been here all along?" Morgana whispered. "In my chambers, serving my meals, guarding my sleep." "Protecting you," Aldrich corrected, still holding Cassius against the wall. "Do you think Lord Cassius was the only one plotting against you? We've prevented 3 assassination attempts in the past 2 months alone." "You could have killed me 100 times over," the Queen said, the reality of her situation beginning to sink in. "But we didn't," Mira replied, "because revenge through murder would have made us the monsters you believed us to be." Aldrich released Cassius with a contemptuous shove. "Tell her, Cassius. Tell her about the letters from the Northern Lords. Tell her about the gold they promised you for delivering a weak queen to their armies." Cassius's face had gone ashen. "You have no proof." "We have the letters," Mira said calmly. "Hidden in your chambers behind the loose stone near your window. Written in your hand. Sealed with your ring." The Queen looked between her supposed protectors and her longtime advisor, the man who had whispered poison in her ear for years. "Cassius, they're lying," he said desperately. "They're the traitors." "You framed me for treason to gain my position," Aldrich said conversationally. "You accused Mira of witchcraft because the people loved her more than they feared you. And you've been slowly poisoning the Queen's mind, making her so paranoid that she'd destroy anyone who might actually serve her faithfully." Morgana rose, on unsteady legs, pieces of a puzzle she'd never seen beginning to fall into place. "The Northern letters. You said they were declarations of loyalty." "They were offers of alliance," Cassius admitted, seeing his lies crumbling. "But only for the good of the kingdom." "For the good of your purse," Mira interrupted. "We found those too. The gold they've been sending as down payment for your cooperation." The Queen walked to her window, staring out at the kingdom she had ruled through fear and suspicion. "All this time the enemies I feared were imaginary, while the real threat sat at my right hand." "Not all imaginary," Aldrich said quietly. "Your paranoia was real, your loneliness was real, your pain was real. Cassius merely fed on it like a parasite." Morgana turned back to face them. What do you want from me? Your lives? Your titles? Revenge? Justice, Mira said simply. For ourselves, for all the innocent people your fear has condemned, and for a kingdom that deserves better than to be sold to foreign lords. And love, Aldrich added, moving to stand beside Mira and taking her hand. We want the right to love each other openly without shame or fear. The Queen looked at their joined hands, scarred and branded, but somehow beautiful in their unity. You found love in the shadows of death. We found each other, Mira corrected. Love was what kept us alive. Queen Morgana closed her eyes, feeling the weight of months of deception and years of unnecessary cruelty. When she opened them again, there was something different in her pale gaze, a clarity that had been absent for far too long. Guards, she called. Armed men entered immediately, and Lord Cassius smiled triumphantly until the Queen spoke again. Arrest Lord Cassius for treason. Search his chambers for evidence of correspondence with enemy nations. He is to be held for trial. As Cassius was dragged away, still protesting his innocence, Morgana turned to face her former enemies. I cannot undo what was done to you, she said quietly. I cannot give you back the pain you suffered or the months you lost, but I can offer you what should have been yours from the beginning, honor, position, and the freedom to build a life together. Aldrich and Mira exchanged a look, communicating silently as lovers do. We accept, Mira said finally, but not as your subjects seeking favor, as partners working toward a better kingdom. Partners, the Queen agreed. Perhaps it's time I learned to trust in something other than fear. 6 months later, the Kingdom of Velthorn celebrated the wedding of Sir Aldrich of Ravenspire, newly restored to his titles and honors, and Lady Mira the Healer, elevated to noble rank for her service to the crown. Queen Morgana herself performed the ceremony, her pale hands steady as she bound their scarred wrists together with silk cords. The knight who had survived fire and the healer who had escaped branding stood before their people not as victims of injustice, but as symbols of hope reborn. Their love had literally risen from ashes, and in healing each other they had helped heal a wounded kingdom. As the celebration continued into the night, Aldrich and Mira slipped away to the castle's highest tower, no longer hiding in shadows, but standing openly in the light of stars and future possibilities. Do you think she'll truly change? Mira asked, her head resting on her husband's shoulder as they looked out over their reclaimed home. People can change when they have reason to hope instead of fear, Aldrich replied, pressing a kiss to her hair. Look at us. We went from dead lovers to living partners in justice. From ashes to crown, she murmured, then smiled. I rather like the poetry of it. I rather like you, he said, turning her in his arms for a kiss that tasted of triumph and promises kept. They had been sentenced to death and somehow found life. They had been torn apart and grown stronger together. They had learned that love could indeed conquer all, not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through the quiet persistence of two souls refusing to let injustice have the final word. The Queen had ordered them burned and branded, but they had lived. And now, standing openly in her castle as honored guests rather than hidden enemies, they had won something far sweeter than revenge. They had won the right to love freely in the light. The shadows had served their purpose, but the sun was so much warmer,